When you look back at all of human history, there are thousands of names that mattered. Kings, conquerors, philosophers, inventors, people who changed borders, laws, and entire civilizations. But here's the wild part. Very few of them still shape how billions of people think, believe, and live their daily lives 2,000 years later. And one name sits right at the center of that reality: Jesus of Nazareth. Think about it. Whether you're Christian, Muslim, Jewish, spiritual, atheist, or somewhere in between, you can't escape his influence. Entire calendars revolve around his life. Massive religions trace their roots back to him. Art, politics, morality, even how people understand good and evil have all been shaped by this one figure. And yet, the more you dig into it, the stranger it gets. Because for someone so famous, Jesus is also incredibly elusive. Ask 10 different people who Jesus was, and you'll probably get 10 very different answers. To some, he's God himself walking the earth. To others, he's a human prophet. To some, he's a myth. To others, a revolutionary, a mystic, a philosopher, or even something far more symbolic. Historians still argue about him, scholars still debate him, and modern culture keeps reinventing him. So here's the real question. Strip away belief, tradition, and theology for a moment. What can we actually know? Did Jesus of Nazareth really exist? And if he did, who was he really, based on history, not faith? That's exactly what this video is about. No preaching, no assumptions, just following the evidence, the sources, and the debates that surround one of the most influential and mysterious figures who ever lived. Before we can even begin answering who Jesus was, we have to slow down and talk about how historians approach questions like this in the first place. Because here's the thing, history doesn't work the way movies or religious traditions often make it seem. Historians don't start with belief, they start with evidence. And when it comes to ancient figures, evidence is always messy, incomplete, and frustrating. So what do scholars actually look for? Ideally, the gold standard is direct material evidence. Things like writings from the person themselves, objects they owned, buildings they lived in, or physical remains. That kind of evidence is rock solid. The problem is, for most people who lived 2,000 years ago, especially poor, rural individuals, that kind of evidence almost never survives. When direct evidence doesn't exist, historians turn to secondary sources. These are writings about a person, usually produced by others. And here, timing matters a lot. The closer a source is to the actual events in time, the more reliable it's generally considered. A text written during someone's lifetime is far more valuable than one written centuries later. Bias also matters. Sources written by followers are useful, but they're treated cautiously. Mentions from outsiders, especially critics, often carry extra weight. And this is where things immediately get complicated with Jesus. From a purely academic standpoint, we don't have a single piece of material evidence that can be directly tied to him. No verified house, no personal objects, no writings in his own hand. Archaeologically speaking, it's basically silence. And yeah, that's a problem. But here's the twist. This lack of evidence is not as unusual as it sounds. Jesus was a Jewish preacher from a remote Roman province. He wasn't a king, he wasn't a general, he wasn't wealthy or politically powerful during his life. Most people in first-century Palestine couldn't read or write, and Roman record-keeping didn't care much about local religious teachers unless they caused serious trouble. Still, the absence of direct evidence has led some people to argue that Jesus never existed at all, that he was a fictional character invented by early Christians. And that idea, while controversial, can't just be brushed aside. It deserves to be examined seriously. So now the stage is set. We've laid out the rules of the game. The question is no longer philosophical or theological, it's historical. What sources do we actually have? When do they appear? And are they strong enough to point to a real person behind the legend? Because this is where things start to get really interesting. All right, so now that we understand how historians evaluate evidence, let's look at what we actually have when it comes to Jesus of Nazareth. And honestly, this is where a lot of people get surprised. If we're looking for contemporary sources, writings produced during Jesus' lifetime, the answer is simple and kind of uncomfortable. There are none. Zero. No Roman records from the 20s or 30s AD mentioning Jesus. No Jewish administrative documents, no letters written by Jesus himself. From a modern perspective, that sounds damning, but context matters. Jesus was executed around the year 30 AD. At that time, he was one of many Jewish preachers operating under Roman rule. From Rome's point of view, he was nobody until the very end, and even then, just another troublemaker crucified by the state. The Romans crucified thousands of people. They didn't document every case in detail. So the lack of direct evidence doesn't automatically mean Jesus didn't exist. It means he lived the kind of life that usually doesn't leave a paper trail. The earliest written sources we do have start appearing a couple of decades later, and surprisingly, they come from within the early Christian movement itself. The oldest texts in the New Testament aren't the Gospels, they're the letters of Paul, written around 50 AD. That's roughly 20 years after Jesus' death, which is actually very close by ancient historical standards. Paul never met Jesus during his lifetime, so he's not an eyewitness, but his letters tell us something crucial. Within just a couple of decades of Jesus' death, there was already a widespread movement across the Roman Empire centered around him. Paul also refers to key figures like James and Peter, people who, according to tradition, personally knew Jesus. That alone strongly suggests Jesus wasn't a late invention. What's interesting, though, is that Paul doesn't spend much time talking about Jesus' life. He focuses on theology, not biography. That job is left to the Gospels. The four Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, were written between roughly 70 and 90 AD. Scholars overwhelmingly agree they were not written by Jesus' disciples themselves, but later followers drawing on earlier oral traditions and sources. They don't always agree with each other, and sometimes they flat out contradict one another on details. That might sound like a problem, but from a historian's perspective, it actually makes them more interesting. Perfectly aligned stories are often a red flag. Still, critics argue that Christian sources can't be trusted because they're biased, and that's a fair concern, which is why the most important question becomes this: do we have any non-Christian sources that mention Jesus? Because if we do, everything changes. And guess what? We do. But this is where things get really serious. Here's where the discussion shifts from interesting to genuinely compelling. Outside of the Bible, we actually have references to Jesus, and these come from people who were not Christians, had no interest in promoting Christianity, and in some cases were openly hostile to it. From a historical perspective, that matters a lot. The most important of these sources is a Jewish historian named Josephus, writing toward the end of the 1st century. Josephus is one of our best sources for life in 1st century Palestine, and historians rely on him heavily for everything from politics to religious movements of the time. In his book Antiquities of the Jews, written around 93 AD, Josephus describes an event involving a Jewish leader named Ananus, who illegally executed several people. And in that passage, Josephus casually mentions James, describing him as the brother of Jesus who was called Christ. That line is huge. Josephus isn't trying to prove Jesus existed. He's not telling a story about Christianity. He's simply identifying James by referencing a figure his audience would recognize. That's exactly the kind of offhand reference historians love, because it strongly suggests Jesus was a known historical figure by that point.
Josephus also includes another longer passage about Jesus, often called the Testimonium Flavium. It describes Jesus as a wise teacher who gained followers, performed surprising deeds, and was executed by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. It even mentions that his followers continued after his death. Now here's the catch. Most scholars agree that this passage was edited by later Christian scribes. Josephus, a devout Jew, almost certainly didn't call Jesus the Messiah or claim he rose from the dead. But, and this is critical, when you strip away those clearly Christian additions, what remains still points to a historical Jesus who was executed and remembered. And Josephus isn't alone. Around 115 AD, a Roman historian named Tacitus wrote about Emperor Nero blaming Christians for the Great Fire of Rome. While explaining who these Christians were,